The wind moves differently through the hills of eastern Kentucky. It doesn't blow, it crawls. Through the hollow trees and over the crooked stones that mark graves no one visits anymore. There's a place there, up past where the road turns to mud and the forest grows so thick the sun barely touches ground, where they say a woman once lived. A woman who married 7 times. They called her Mary Elmswood, though that wasn't the name she was born with. The first husband disappeared in the spring of 1903. The second, that same autumn. By the time the 7th man stood at her door, 6 had already gone into the earth, or the river, or the dark spaces between the trees where sound itself seems to die. But the 7th husband, he lived. And what he told the county sheriff in 1909 changed everything anyone thought they knew about marriage, about trust, about the thing that can live inside a human face and smile while it watches you sleep. This is not a story about a widow. This is a story about a woman who collected men the way some people collect debts, and when the time came to settle accounts, there was nothing left but silence and the smell of turned soil in a root cellar that nobody ever wanted to enter twice. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Mary Elmswood first appeared in Pike County, Kentucky, in the winter of 1898. No one knew where she came from. The census records show nothing. No family name. No previous address. She simply arrived one February morning on the back of a timber wagon, wearing a dress the color of ash and carrying a single leather case that looked older than she was. The driver, a man named Silas Cord, told the locals she'd paid him $2 to bring her up from the rail station in Prestonsburg, but when asked where she'd come from before that, he just shook his head and said she hadn't spoke a word the entire ride. She took a room above the general store on Main Street, which wasn't really a street at all, just a wider stretch of mud between 2 rows of clapboard buildings that leaned into each other like drunks. The store owner, a widow named Agnes Hallowell, later told the circuit judge that Mary had pale eyes, the kind that didn't seem to fix on anything, and hands that were too soft for a woman traveling alone. She paid 3 months' rent in advance in coins that looked foreign, though Agnes couldn't say from where. Mary didn't work. She didn't attend church. For the first 2 months, she hardly left her room, but the men noticed her. They always did. The first husband was a man named Thomas Shrewsbury. He was 41 years old, a timber foreman with a reputation for hard work and harder drinking. He'd been a widower for 5 years, his wife having died in childbirth along with the baby, and he lived alone in a 2-room cabin about 3 miles up Coldwater Creek. Thomas was not a handsome man. His face had been broken by a falling branch in 1894, leaving his nose flat and his left eye slightly lower than the right. But he had land, nearly 80 acres, and a bank account that held more than most men in the county would see in a lifetime. On March 19, 1899, Thomas Shrewsbury walked into the general store and saw Mary Elmswood standing by the window, looking out at the rain. According to Agnes Hallowell's later testimony, Thomas stood in the doorway for a full minute, water dripping from his hat, just staring. Then he walked over and introduced himself. They were married 6 days later by a traveling preacher who'd come through town selling Bibles and performing ceremonies for $2 each. There was no reception, no witnesses except the preacher and Agnes, who signed the marriage certificate with a hand she said was shaking, though she couldn't explain why. Thomas brought Mary to his cabin on Coldwater Creek. For 3 weeks, everything seemed normal. He continued working the timber lines. She kept the house, though neighbors would later say they never saw smoke from the chimney during the day, never saw laundry on the line. A woman named Ruth Pickett, who lived a half-mile down the creek, told the sheriff that she'd walked up to the cabin once to bring Mary a basket of preserves as a wedding gift. But when she knocked on the door, Mary answered it only halfway, standing in the gap so Ruth couldn't see inside. Mary thanked her, took the basket, and closed the door without inviting her in. Ruth said later that she'd heard something from inside the cabin, a sound like someone dragging a heavy sack across the floor, but she convinced herself it was nothing. On April 11, 1903, Thomas Shrewsbury didn't show up for work. The foreman sent 2 men to check on him. They found the cabin empty. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked normal. The bed was made. Dishes were clean and stacked by the basin. Thomas's coat was still hanging on the peg by the door. But Thomas was gone, and so was Mary. The search lasted 4 days. They dragged the creek. They walked the timber lines. They checked every cabin and linta within 10 miles. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle. On the 5th day, Mary Elmswood walked into the sheriff's office in Pikeville and reported her husband missing. She was calm. Her dress was clean. She told Sheriff Amos Prout that she'd woken up on the morning of April 11th and Thomas was gone. She assumed he'd left early for work. When he didn't return that evening, she'd walked to town to report it. The sheriff asked her why it had taken her 5 days. She said she'd been frightened, alone in the cabin, and hadn't known what to do. Prout didn't believe her, but he had no evidence. No witnesses. No body. He let her go. Mary returned to her room above the general store. 3 weeks later, she was seen having supper with a man named Edward Finch. Edward Finch was 36 years old, a blacksmith with a shop on the south end of town. He'd never been married. He lived above his shop in a single room that smelled like coal smoke and hot iron. He was a quiet man, the kind who kept to himself, but he had a weakness for women who seemed lost, and Mary Elmswood seemed very lost. They courted for 2 months. In late June of 1903, they married in the same fashion as before, with the same traveling preacher who happened to be passing through again. This time, there were no witnesses at all. Edward brought Mary to live above the blacksmith shop. The arrangement seemed strange to the townspeople. A woman like Mary, who'd been living in a timber foreman's cabin with 80 acres around it, now crammed into a room above a shop where the heat from the forge made sleep nearly impossible in summer. But Mary didn't complain. She was seen occasionally in town, buying flour and salt pork, always alone, always quiet. Edward continued his work. Then, on September 2, 1903, Edward Finch closed his shop in the middle of the day and never opened it again. A customer, a farmer named Dale Hutchins, came by that afternoon to pick up a repaired plow blade and found the shop locked, the forge cold. He knocked on the door to the upstairs room. No answer. He waited an hour, then went to find the sheriff. Prout came with 2 deputies. They broke the door open. Inside, the room was empty. Edward's tools were still there. His clothes were still hanging on the wall, but Edward and Mary were both gone. This time, the sheriff organized a larger search. They checked the rail station, the river, the roads leading out of town. Nothing. It was as if 2 people had simply evaporated. Then 3 days later, Mary Elmswood appeared at the boarding house on Elm Street asking for a room. She told the landlady, a woman named Clara Dinsmore, that her husband had abandoned her. She had no money. She needed work. Clara, who later testified that she felt an overwhelming sense of pity for Mary, let her stay in exchange for cleaning and cooking. Mary lived there for 6 weeks. During that time, she met a man named Jacob Morrill. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Jacob Morrill was a school teacher, 29 years old, with a small inheritance from his father and a house on the eastern edge of town. He was well-read, soft-spoken, and considered by most to be too gentle for the rough life of Pike County. He'd been engaged once, to a girl from Prestonsburg, but she died of scarlet fever 2 years before Mary arrived. Jacob met Mary at the boarding house when he came to visit Clara Dinsmore, who was his mother's cousin. Clara introduced them. Jacob was immediately taken with Mary. He later wrote in a letter to his brother, a letter that survives in the Pike County Historical Society, that Mary had a sadness about her that made him want to protect her. He wrote that she reminded him of a bird with a broken wing, beautiful and fragile. They were married on November 7, 1903, in a private ceremony at Jacob's house. This time, there was no preacher. Jacob performed the vows himself, reading from a book of poetry, and they signed a document that Jacob had written out by hand. It wasn't legally binding, but to them, it was enough. Mary moved into Jacob's house. For a while, it seemed she might finally settle. Jacob's house was small but well kept, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above. He continued teaching at the schoolhouse 3 miles down the road, leaving early each morning and returning in the late afternoon. Mary stayed home. Neighbors later said they rarely saw her outside. A woman named Edith Crane, who lived across the road, testified that she'd seen Mary standing in the window some mornings, just standing there, not moving, for an hour or more. Edith said it unsettled her, the way Mary would stare out at nothing as if she were waiting for something. On the night of December 19, 1903, Jacob Morrill didn't come home from school. The children had been dismissed at the usual time. The schoolhouse was locked. Jacob's horse and cart were still tied outside, but Jacob was gone. The school board organized a search. They found his coat on the ground near the edge of the woods behind the schoolhouse. There was no blood. No signs of an attack, just the coat folded neatly and placed on a flat stone. When the sheriff went to Jacob's house to inform Mary, he found the door open and the house empty. Mary was gone. Again. This time the town began to talk. 3 husbands, all disappeared, all within 9 months. The sheriff brought Mary in for questioning when she reappeared a week later, staying at a different boarding house on the north side of town. She told the same story. Jacob had left for work. She'd waited for him to return. When he didn't, she became frightened and left. Prout pressed her. Where did she go when she left? She said she'd walked into the woods and stayed in an abandoned cabin she'd found. Which cabin? She couldn't remember. Why didn't she report Jacob missing? She said she was afraid no one would believe her. Prout asked her directly if she'd had anything to do with the disappearances of her husbands. Mary looked at him with those pale eyes and said no. She said it so calmly, so simply, that Prout later told his deputy it made his skin crawl. But again, there was no evidence, no bodies, no witnesses. He had to let her go. Mary left the sheriff's office and walked back to the boarding house. Within 2 weeks, she was seen with a man named Samuel Good. Samuel Good was a fool. That's what everyone said later. A fool and a drunk. He was 48 years old, a former coal miner who'd lost 3 fingers in a shaft collapse and now lived on a small pension and whatever he could win at cards. He had no house, just a shed behind the livery stable where he slept on a pile of old blankets. Why a man like Samuel Good would marry a woman like Mary Elmswood is a question that has no good answer, except that loneliness makes people do strange things, and Samuel was very lonely. They married in January of 1904, in a ceremony performed by a drunk justice of the peace who later said he didn't remember it. Samuel brought Mary to his shed. They lived there for exactly 19 days. On January 30th, 1904, the livery stable owner, a man named Otto Brenner, went to the shed to collect rent and found it empty. Samuel was gone. Mary was gone. The blankets were gone. The only thing left was a smell, something Otto described as sweet and rotten, like meat left too long in summer heat. Otto reported it to the sheriff. Prout was beginning to feel like a character in a ghost story, the kind where the same thing happens over and over until someone finally breaks the pattern. He organized another search, but by this point, the men of Pike County were starting to refuse. They didn't want to go looking for Samuel Good. They didn't want to find what might be left of him. The search lasted 2 days and turned up nothing. Mary Elmswood appeared again a week later, this time staying with a family on the outskirts of town who didn't know her history. When the family found out, they asked her to leave. Mary moved to a small cabin she rented from a man who owned several properties and didn't care who lived in them as long as the rent was paid. She paid 6 months in advance. The money came from somewhere, though no one could say where. In March of 1904, she met a man named William Cross. William Cross was different from the others. He was educated. He'd studied law in Lexington and had returned to Pike County to open a small practice. He was 33 years old, unmarried, and considered by most to be the most eligible bachelor in the county. Why William Cross took an interest in Mary Elmswood is still debated by historians who study this case. Some say he saw her as a damsel in distress. a woman wronged by circumstance and cruel rumors. Others say he was arrogant, believing he could solve the mystery of her missing husbands where the sheriff had failed. Whatever his reasons, William began courting Mary in the spring of 1904. He was seen with her frequently, walking through town, dining at the hotel restaurant, attending church together. The townspeople watched with a mixture of fascination and dread. They whispered. They warned him. A delegation of 3 men, including the sheriff, went to William's office and told him directly that they believed Mary Elmswood was responsible for the disappearances of her previous husbands. William listened politely, then told them they were engaged in gossip and slander. He married Mary on May 2, 1904. William brought Mary to his house, a well-built structure on 2 acres just outside town. It had 4 rooms, a covered porch, and a root cellar that William's father had dug years before. The house was the nicest Mary had lived in since Thomas Shrewsbury's cabin. William continued his law practice. Mary kept the house. For the first time, she seemed to make an effort to fit in. She attended church regularly. She joined the women's auxiliary. She baked bread and brought it to neighbors. Some of the women began to soften toward her, thinking perhaps they'd been wrong. Perhaps the disappearances had been coincidence or the work of some unknown predator in the hills. Then, on July 9, 1904, William Cross didn't come home from his office. His clerk, a young man named Peter Daniels, found the office locked at the end of the day, which was unusual. William never locked the office while he was inside. Peter knocked. No answer. He went around to the back window and looked inside. The office was empty. William's desk was neat. His coat was hanging on the rack, but William was gone. Peter ran to get the sheriff. By the time Prout arrived, a crowd had gathered. They went to William's house. Mary answered the door. She was calm as always. She said William had come home for lunch, then left to return to the office. She hadn't seen him since. Prout asked if he could search the house. Mary stepped aside and let him in. Prout and his deputies searched every room. They found nothing unusual. When they opened the door to the root cellar, Mary stood at the top of the stairs and watched them descend. The cellar was dark, cool, with walls of packed earth and shelves lined with jars of preserves. There was a smell, faint but present, that Prout later described as chemical, like lye or ammonia. They found no body, no evidence. They searched the property, the woods surrounding the house, the road to town. Nothing. William Cross had vanished just like the others. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? This time the sheriff arrested Mary. He had no evidence, no body, no witness, but he arrested her anyway on suspicion of murder. Mary was taken to the county jail, a small stone building with 4 cells. She was placed in one and held for 3 days while Prout tried desperately to build a case. He interviewed everyone who'd known her. He reviewed the marriage records. He searched her cabin, her belongings, everything he could find. He sent telegrams to surrounding counties asking if anyone knew anything about a woman matching Mary's description. The responses came back negative. No one had heard of her. No one knew where she'd come from. It was as if she'd appeared from nowhere. On the 3rd day, the circuit judge, a man named Horace Fielding, came to Pikeville and reviewed the case. He told Prout that without evidence, without a body, without even a witness to place Mary near the scene of any disappearance, he had no choice but to release her. Prout argued. He begged. He told the judge that 5 men had married this woman and 5 men had disappeared. The judge agreed it was suspicious, but suspicion was not proof. Mary was released. She left the jail and walked out of Pikeville. No one saw where she went. For 3 months, there were no sightings of Mary Elmswood. The townspeople began to believe she'd finally left, moved on to some other place where her history wasn't known. But in October of 1904, a woman matching Mary's description was seen in Whitesburg, a town about 30 miles south of Pikeville. She was using a different name, calling herself Mary Ashford. She was staying at a boarding house and working as a seamstress. Within a month, she'd met a man named Charles Riddle. Charles was 52 years old, a merchant who owned a dry goods store. He was a widower with 2 grown children who no longer lived in the area. He was lonely, trusting, and prosperous. They married in December of 1904. 3 months later, Charles Riddle disappeared. This time the pattern was too obvious to ignore. The sheriff in Whitesburg, a man named George Keller, contacted Sheriff Prout in Pikeville. They compared notes. The similarities were undeniable. Prout traveled to Whitesburg and interviewed the people who'd known Charles and Mary. The story was the same. Charles had been a good man, a reliable man. He'd gone to work one morning and never returned. Mary had reported him missing, claimed she didn't know what had happened, and then moved to a different boarding house. Keller and Prout decided to work together. They put out notices in newspapers across eastern Kentucky, warning men about a woman who went by different names and married quickly. They included a description: pale eyes, soft hands, quiet demeanor. The notices were published in 6 counties. It's unclear if they did any good, because by the time they were printed, Mary had already left Whitesburg. She was next spotted in Hazard, Kentucky, in the spring of 1905. This time she called herself Mary Cordell. She'd taken a job as a housekeeper for an elderly man named Josiah Fenton, who lived alone in a large house on the edge of town. Josiah was 73 years old, nearly deaf, and suffering from failing health. His children had moved to Cincinnati years before and rarely visited. Mary cared for him with what appeared to be genuine kindness. She cooked his meals, cleaned his house, helped him dress. The neighbors said she was a godsend. Josiah seemed happier than he'd been in years. In June of 1905, Josiah changed his will, leaving everything to Mary. His children, when they learned of this months later, were furious, but by then it was too late. On August 14, 1905, Josiah Fenton died in his sleep. The doctor who examined him said it appeared to be natural causes, heart failure likely, which was not uncommon for a man of his age and condition. Mary inherited the house and all of Josiah's savings, nearly $4,000. This is where the story takes a turn, because Mary didn't disappear. She stayed in Hazard. She lived in Josiah's house. She was seen in town, shopping, attending church, living what appeared to be a normal life. The rumors from Pikeville and Whitesburg eventually reached Hazard, but by the time they did, Mary had established herself as a respectable widow. When the sheriff in Hazard, a man named Luke Garrison, received a letter from Sheriff Prout detailing Mary's history, Garrison went to her house to question her. Mary invited him in. She served him coffee. She answered his questions calmly and directly. She admitted she'd been married multiple times. She admitted her husbands had disappeared. She said it was tragic, but she had nothing to do with it. She suggested that perhaps she was cursed, that perhaps God was punishing her for some unknown sin. Garrison later told Prout that he found her convincing, almost sympathetic. He didn't arrest her. He had no reason to. Josiah Fenton had died of natural causes. There was no crime. Mary lived in Hazard for 2 years. During that time, she was courted by several men, but she refused them all. People began to think that perhaps she'd learned her lesson, that perhaps she was done with marriage. Then, in the fall of 1907, a man came to town. His name was Henry Blackwell. He was 44 years old, a surveyor working for a mining company that was expanding operations into Perry County. Henry was educated, well-traveled, and confident. He'd been married once before, but his wife had died of typhoid fever in Ohio. Henry met Mary at a church social. According to witnesses, he was immediately interested in her. He pursued her aggressively, calling on her nearly every day. Mary resisted at first, but Henry was persistent. They were married in January of 1908. Henry moved into Josiah Fenton's house with Mary. He continued his work as a surveyor, which required him to be away for days at a time, traveling into the hills to map coal deposits. Mary stayed home. Neighbors said the marriage seemed stable, even happy. Henry was often heard praising Mary, telling people how lucky he was to have found her. Then, in April of 1908, Henry left for a surveying trip into the mountains east of Hazard. He was expected to be gone for 5 days. He never returned. The mining company sent a search party. They found Henry's camp, his equipment, his horse, but Henry was gone. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened. The company assumed he'd fallen into a ravine or been attacked by a bear. They searched for a week, then gave up. Mary reported him missing to the sheriff. Garrison questioned her again. Again, she had no answers. She said Henry had left for work and never came back. She seemed genuinely distressed, even tearful. Garrison didn't know what to do. He contacted Pruitt again. The two sheriffs agreed that something was deeply wrong, but they still had no evidence, no way to prove that Mary was involved. Mary inherited Henry's savings and his possessions. She continued living in the house in Hazard, but now people avoided her. The rumors had become too loud, the pattern too obvious. Women crossed the street when they saw her coming. Men refused to speak to her. Mary became isolated. In the summer of 1908, she sold the house and left Hazard. She was seen boarding a train heading east toward Virginia. For months, there was no word of her. Sheriffs Pruitt and Garrison assumed she'd left Kentucky for good. Then, in the spring of 1909, a telegram arrived in Pikeville. It was from a sheriff in Wise County, Virginia. A man named Michael Torrance had walked into his office with a story that seemed impossible. Michael Torrance claimed he was the seventh husband of a woman named Mary Elmswood, and he was certain she was trying to kill him. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Michael Torrance was 38 years old, a railroad worker from Big Stone Gap, Virginia. He'd met Mary in the winter of 1908 at a boarding house in Norton, a small town near the Kentucky border. Mary had been using the name Mary Haynes. She told Michael she was a widow, that her husband had died in a mining accident. Michael was sympathetic. He was also lonely. He'd been working the railroad for 12 years, moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to build a life. Mary represented stability, someone to come home to. They married in February of 1909. Michael rented a small house in Big Stone Gap and Mary moved in with him. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. Then Michael began to notice things. He noticed that Mary was often awake when he came home late from work, sitting in the dark, not reading, not sewing, just sitting. He noticed that she rarely ate, that she seemed to have no appetite. He noticed that she asked him detailed questions about his work schedule, about when he'd be home, about where he went. At first, he thought she was just worried about him, concerned for his safety. Then he found the letters. They were hidden in a box under the bed, dozens of them, written in different hands but all addressed to Mary under different names. Mary Shrewsbury, Mary Finch, Mary Morrill, Mary Good, Mary Cross, Mary Riddle, Mary Fenton, Mary Blackwell. The letters were from men, some of them love letters, some of them business correspondence. Michael confronted Mary. She told him the letters were from her previous husbands, that she'd kept them as mementos. Michael asked her how many times she'd been married. Mary hesitated, then said she couldn't remember. Michael asked her what had happened to her husbands. Mary said they'd all died or disappeared. Michael felt something cold settle in his chest. He began to watch Mary more closely. He noticed that she went into the root cellar frequently, sometimes for an hour or more. He noticed that there was a smell coming from the cellar, faint but unpleasant. One day when Mary was out, Michael went down into the cellar. It was dark, lit only by the small window near the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, and on the shelves were jars, dozens of jars. Michael opened one. Inside was a thick, dark liquid. It smelled chemical, acrid. He opened another, the same. He realized with growing horror that there were nearly 100 jars, all filled with the same substance. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't food. He went back upstairs and waited for Mary to return. When she came home, he asked her what was in the jars. Mary looked at him with those pale eyes and said it was medicine. Michael asked what kind of medicine. Mary said it was for preservation. Michael asked what she meant. Mary smiled and said sometimes things need to be kept. That night Michael couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Mary, listening to her breathe, and realized he was afraid. He was afraid of his wife. The next morning he told Mary he had to work a double shift and wouldn't be home until late. Instead, He went to the sheriff's office in Big Stone Gap and told his story. The sheriff, a man named Vernon Hayes, didn't know what to make of it at first. But when Michael mentioned the name Mary Elmswood and the previous husbands, Hayes remembered hearing something about a woman from Kentucky. He sent a telegram to Sheriff Prout in Pikeville. Prout responded immediately, confirming the story and adding details. Hayes realized he might finally have the witness he needed to build a case. He went with Michael back to the house. Mary was there, sitting in the kitchen, calm as ever. Hayes asked if he could search the property. Mary said yes. Hayes and 2 deputies went down into the root cellar. They found the jars. They opened them and examined the contents. The liquid was lye mixed with something else, something organic. Hayes took several jars as evidence. He asked Mary what they were for. Mary repeated that it was medicine for preservation. Hayes asked what she was preserving. Mary didn't answer. Hayes arrested her on suspicion of murder. This time there was evidence. The jars, the letters, Michael's testimony. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to hold her. Mary was taken to the county jail in Wise County, Virginia. She was held there for 3 months while Hayes and Prout worked together to build a case. They exhumed the area around Josiah Fenton's house in Hazard. They searched the properties where Mary had lived with her previous husbands. They found nothing. No bodies, no bones, no evidence of foul play. It was as if the men had simply ceased to exist. The case went to trial in August of 1909. Mary was charged with the murder of Henry Blackwell, the only case where they could establish that she'd been the last person to see him alive and had directly benefited from his disappearance. The trial lasted 6 days. The prosecution presented the jars, the letters, Michael's testimony, and the testimony of dozens of people from Kentucky who'd known Mary and her missing husbands. The defense argued that all of it was circumstantial, that there was no body, no proof that Henry Blackwell or any of the others had been murdered. They suggested that the men had simply left, that Mary had been unlucky in love, that the jars contained nothing more than homemade cleaning solution. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They returned a verdict of not guilty. There wasn't enough evidence. The judge dismissed the case. Mary Elmswood walked out of the courthouse a free woman. But she didn't stay free for long. The community in Big Stone Gap refused to let her return. A mob formed outside the courthouse, demanding she leave town. The sheriff, fearing violence, escorted Mary to the train station and put her on a train heading west. She was last seen in the fall of 1909, boarding a train in Knoxville, Tennessee. After that, there are no confirmed sightings of Mary Elmswood. Some say she changed her name again and disappeared into the growing cities of the Midwest. Others say she died alone in a boarding house somewhere, her secrets buried with her. But there are stories, persistent stories, of a woman who appeared in small towns across the Ohio Valley in the 1910s and 20s, a woman who married men who then disappeared, a woman with pale eyes and soft hands who left nothing behind but questions. Michael Torrance, the 7th husband, the one who survived, gave several interviews in the years following the trial. He told reporters that he believed Mary had killed all of her previous husbands, though he couldn't prove it. He said he thought the jars in the cellar contained the remains of the men, dissolved in lye, reduced to liquid and stored like preserves. He said Mary had been planning to do the same to him, but he discovered her secret before she could act. When asked why Mary would do such a thing, Michael had no answer. He said she'd never shown anger, never shown violence. She was always calm, always quiet. He said it was as if she wasn't human, as if she was something else wearing a human face. In 1914, Michael Torrance died in a railroad accident in West Virginia. He was 43 years old. Some say it was bad luck. Others say Mary found him. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The investigation into Mary Elmswood didn't end with the trial. Sheriff Prout continued searching for evidence until he retired in 1915. He spent years trying to find the bodies of the missing men, convinced they were buried somewhere on the properties where Mary had lived. He excavated the yard at Thomas Shrewsbury's cabin on Coldwater Creek. He dug up the floor of the shed where Samuel Good had lived. He searched the woods behind the schoolhouse where Jacob Morrill had disappeared. He found nothing. In his final report, written just before he retired, Prout concluded that Mary Elmswood had somehow disposed of the bodies in a way that left no trace. He believed the lye jars were the key, that she dissolved the remains and poured them into the rivers or buried them in the forests where they'd never be found. He wrote that Mary was the most dangerous person he'd ever encountered, not because she was violent, but because she was patient, methodical, and completely without conscience. The case became famous in the region. Newspapers across Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee ran stories about the woman with 7 husbands. Some called her a monster. Others called her a victim of circumstance, a woman who'd been unlucky enough to attract the attention of men who met tragic ends. Folklorists began to collect stories about Mary, adding supernatural elements. They said she was a witch, that she'd made a pact with the devil, that she could disappear at will. These stories overshadowed the facts, turning Mary Elmswood into a legend rather than a person. But the facts, the documented facts, are disturbing enough without embellishment. 7 marriages, 6 disappearances, no bodies, no evidence, and one survivor who spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. In the decades following the trial, researchers and historians have tried to uncover who Mary Elmswood really was. They've searched census records, birth certificates, immigration logs. They've found nothing. There's no record of anyone named Mary Elmswood before she appeared in Pike County in 1898. The name itself is almost certainly an alias. Some researchers believe she was an immigrant, possibly from Eastern Europe, who changed her name upon entering the United States. Others believe she was an American who'd committed crimes elsewhere and was hiding from the law. A few believe she was mentally ill, suffering from a disorder that compelled her to form attachments to men, and then remove them when the attachment became too real. But these are all theories, guesses built on the absence of information. The truth is, no one knows who Mary Elmswood was or where she came from. She appeared, she married, she made men disappear. And then she vanished herself, leaving behind only questions and the lingering sense that something fundamentally wrong had walked among the people of eastern Kentucky for 11 years. The properties where Mary lived with her husbands have all changed hands multiple times. Some have been torn down. Others still stand, quietly decaying in the hollows and hills. Local people avoid them. There are stories of strange occurrences, of cold spots in certain rooms, of the smell of lye rising from root cellars, of the sound of footsteps when no one is there. These stories are almost certainly the product of suggestion and fear, the human need to make sense of senselessness by attributing it to ghosts rather than to the simple, terrible fact that some people are capable of things the rest of us can't comprehend. But the stories persist, passed down through generations, becoming part of the folklore of the region. In Pike County, there's still a saying among older residents. When someone asks about a person who's recently moved to town, someone whose history is unknown, the response is sometimes, "Let's hope they're not another Mary Elmswood." The letters that Michael Torrance found under the bed were entered into evidence during the trial. After the trial, they were stored in the county archives. In 1963, a graduate student researching unsolved crimes in Appalachia found them and transcribed several. The letters revealed little about Mary herself, but they showed how her husbands had felt about her. They wrote with affection, with love, with trust. Thomas Shrewsbury wrote to his brother that he'd finally found peace after years of loneliness. Jacob Morrill wrote to a friend that Mary was the kindest woman he'd ever met. Henry Blackwell wrote to a colleague that he considered himself blessed to have found her. These were not men who feared their wives. They were men who loved them. And that perhaps is the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Mary didn't terrorize her victims. She didn't threaten them. She made them love her, made them trust her completely, and then she removed them from existence with such efficiency that not a single trace remained. The question that haunted everyone involved in the case, the question that still haunts those who study it today, is why? Why did Mary Elmswood do what she did? She didn't seem to be motivated by money, though she inherited property and savings from her husbands. She lived simply, never spending extravagantly. She didn't seem to be motivated by hatred or revenge. She showed no anger, no cruelty. She didn't seem to be motivated by passion or madness. She was always calm, always in control. Some have suggested she was a serial killer in the modern sense, someone who killed for the psychological satisfaction it provided. But if that's true, she was unlike any serial killer before or since. She didn't escalate. She didn't take trophies. She didn't brag or confess. She simply moved from town to town, from man to man, leaving absence in her wake. Perhaps the most frightening possibility is that there was no why, that Mary acted without motive in any recognizable sense, that she existed in some psychological space where other people weren't quite real to her, where ending a life was no more significant than closing a door. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? There's one more piece to this story, a piece that wasn't discovered until 1972. A historian named Margaret Blaine was researching women's lives in rural Appalachia and came across references to Mary Elmswood. Intrigued, she began digging deeper. She contacted descendants of the people who'd known Mary, searched old newspapers, tracked down court records. In a small archive in Prestonsburg, Kentucky, she found something that had been overlooked for decades. It was a birth certificate, dated 1876, for a girl named Mary Adelaide Shroud, born in Harlan County, Kentucky. The certificate listed the mother's name as Elizabeth Shroud, father unknown. Blaine searched for more records of Mary Adelaide Shroud and found a notation in a county asylum register from 1894. Mary Adelaide Shroud, age 18, had been committed to the Eastern Kentucky Asylum for the insane for what was described as melancholia and dissociative episodes. She'd been released after 2 years in 1896 into the care of a distant relative. After that, the trail went cold. No further records existed, but the timing matched. If Mary Adelaide Shroud left the asylum in 1896 and took on a new identity, she could have appeared in Pike County as Mary Elmswood in 1898. Blaine tried to confirm whether Mary Adelaide Shroud and Mary Elmswood were the same person. She examined the asylum records more closely and found notes written by the attending physician. The notes described Mary Adelaide as a young woman who didn't respond to treatment, who rarely spoke, who seemed to exist in a world separate from everyone around her. The physician wrote that she showed no emotion, no connection to other patients or staff. He wrote that she seemed to be waiting for something, though when asked what, she never answered. The physician recommended she remain institutionalized indefinitely, but budget cuts and overcrowding led to her release. Blaine believed this was Mary Elmswood. She believed that whatever had broken inside Mary Adelaide Shroud during her time in the asylum had created the woman who would go on to marry 7 men and make 6 of them disappear. But Blaine could never prove it definitively. The asylum burned down in 1908, destroying most of its records. The only thing left was the brief notation and the physician's notes, fragments of a life that might explain everything or might explain nothing at all. The story of Mary Elmswood ends without resolution. There's no grave to visit, no final confession, no moment of justice or closure. The men she married are still missing. The families they left behind spent decades searching for answers that never came. The towns where Mary lived still carry the weight of her presence, a shadow that never quite fades. In 1909, after the trial, a journalist asked Michael Torrance what he thought had happened to the missing men. Michael said he thought they were still there in the houses, in the cellars, in the very walls. He said he thought Mary had found a way to keep them close, to preserve them in some form, even if no one could see them. He said sometimes, late at night, he could still hear them, a sound like breathing in the dark, a presence just beyond the edge of perception. The journalist asked if he believed in ghosts. Michael said no. He said he believed in something worse, in the idea that a person could be erased so completely that even their death left no mark, that they could be gone and not gone at the same time, trapped in an absence that had weight and form. The final mystery, the one that remains unsolved to this day, is where Mary Elmswood went after she left Tennessee in 1909. There are no confirmed sightings, no death records under any of her known names, no trail to follow. She could have lived another 40 years, died in obscurity, been buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. Or she could have continued, marrying more men, leaving more absences, moving through the expanding American landscape like a ghost herself. Some researchers believe she's still out there in a sense, that women like her don't simply stop, that the pattern, once established, becomes compulsive. They've looked for similar cases in the decades following 1909, cases of women who married multiple men who then disappeared without explanation. They've found a few. In Ohio, a woman named Sarah Maddox married 4 men between 1912 and 1920, all of whom vanished. In Missouri, a woman named Clara Benton married 3 men in the 1920s, none of whom were ever seen again. Were these women inspired by Mary Elmswood? Were they the same person using different names? Or were they separate individuals, evidence that what Mary did wasn't unique, but rather a dark potential that exists in more people than we want to believe? The legacy of Mary Elmswood is not just the men who disappeared, though they're reason enough to remember her. It's what her story reveals about the limits of justice, the gaps in our ability to protect people from those who mean them harm. Mary operated in a time and place where record-keeping was inconsistent, where communication between jurisdictions was slow, where a person could reinvent themselves simply by moving to the next town. She exploited those gaps with precision. But even more than that, she exploited trust. The men who married her weren't fools. They were lonely, yes, but they were also rational adults who chose to trust someone who seemed kind, who seemed lost, who seemed to need them. And that trust killed them or made them disappear, which in the end is the same thing. The lesson, if there is one, is that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't wear a monster's face. Sometimes it looks like someone who needs help, someone who makes you feel protective, someone who makes you feel necessary. And by the time you realize what you're dealing with, it's already too late. The hills of eastern Kentucky still hold their secrets. The forests are deep, the rivers are cold, and the earth keeps what's buried. If the bodies of Thomas Shrewsbury, Edward Finch, Jacob Morrill, Samuel Good, William Cross, and Henry Blackwell are out there, they've never been found. If Mary Elmswood is buried somewhere, her grave unmarked and forgotten, no one knows where. The case remains open in Pike County, though no active investigation has taken place in over 100 years. The files sit in the archives, yellowed and brittle, a record of failure and frustration. Sheriff Pruitt's final report ends with a single sentence, written in careful longhand. He wrote, "I believe we have encountered something that does not fit our understanding of human behavior, and I fear there are others like her." Whether he was right is a question that can't be answered. But the fear he expressed, the idea that Mary Elmswood was not an anomaly but a type, that there might be others moving quietly through the world, choosing victims, making them disappear, is a fear that has never quite gone away. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? So we return to where we began, to the wind moving differently through the hills, to the place where Mary Elmswood first appeared and the places she left behind. The houses still stand, some of them. The root cellars still descend into darkness. The rivers still flow, carrying whatever they carry to places no one looks. And somewhere in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, the question remains. Not what happened to the 6 men who vanished, though that question matters. Not where Mary Elmswood went, though that question haunts. The real question, the one that keeps this case alive more than a century later, is simpler and more terrible. How many others were there? How many other towns, other husbands, other disappearances that were never connected, never investigated, never linked to a quiet woman with pale eyes who moved through the world like smoke? We don't know. We can't know. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the true horror of Mary Elmswood is not what she did, but what she represents, the idea that someone can walk among us, marry us, live beside us, and we'll never know what they really are until it's far, far too late. The seventh husband knew. He survived to tell us. But the other six they trusted and they vanished, and they're still out there somewhere in the dark places where the wind crawls and the earth keeps its secrets. And Mary, wherever she is, whatever became of her, she's still keeping hers.